4 iconic English gardens. Each is the product of one moment in history, and each gives us a fascinating window into the century in which they were made and the people who created them. Much more than just a history of gardening, these are extraordinary tales of escape, social ambition, heartbreak, downfall, and disaster. In unraveling these remarkable stories, we reach back over the centuries to see these 4 great gardens through fresh eyes and gain a greater understanding of their real significance. Nymans is situated on top of a hill overlooking the picturesque Sussex Weald. The garden is the creation of 3 generations of one highly creative family. With its roots in the 19th century, Nymans went on to become one of the most fashionable and romantic gardens of the Edwardian and interwar years.
One of the critical transformations that takes place in the life of this garden is the change from high Victoriana into Edwardian-style gardens. By the time the Edwardian era came along, it was about compartmentalization, creating spaces that were usable, they were human, they were spaces in which to entertain, they were spaces in which to socialize.
The garden's creation is an extraordinary story shaped by the most turbulent half-century in recent history.
What fascinates me here is that this garden was created by a German family of Jewish descent who not only managed to rise to the top of society in England, but they also created one of the most quintessential English gardens.
Nymans Garden is spread over a large rural area bordered with fields and woodland. As well as having grand open parkland with spectacular views, there are smaller, more intimate spaces. The gardens are both informal and formal, and are filled with exuberant plants.
You don't see the trees that we're seeing today at Nymans in parks and towns or cities. This is quite a unique collection of trees.
But at its heart is an extraordinary, mysterious Gothic ruin which overlooks the garden, a poignant reminder of a disastrous event to hit the family who lived here.
It endured despite the fact that almost every conceivable disaster and challenge was thrown at it.
Today, the garden is run by the National Trust and is one of the most visited in the country. It embodies all that we've come to expect of the archetypal English garden, yet it was created by a so-called foreigner, Ludwig Messel. Ludwig's family were successful bankers who originated from a small town called Messel in Germany. Ludwig Messel, together with his brother, came to London in the 1860s in search of further opportunity, reputedly with gold coins sewn into their shirts. Ludwig was ambitious and had a keen financial mind. He founded a successful stockbroking business and was part of a new emerging class of wealthy financiers. In 1871, he married Annie Cossins, and they had 6 children who ranged in 17 years from eldest Lenny to youngest Muriel. Ludwig set out to find a house in the country to bring up his large family. New railways meant the Sussex Weald and neighbouring counties became the perfect getaway, soon to be known as the stockbroker belt. Land was cheap and plentiful, and Ludwig quickly purchased Nymans. The Georgian house came with 600 acres, including woodland, fields, farm cottages, and a small 4-acre garden. Ludwig saw it as the perfect home for his family, but it also fulfilled his desire to be accepted by society. Historian Andrea Wolff is going to unravel the Messels' life story and what prompted them to start a new life in rural Sussex.
The moment the English countryside or the kind of traditional rural life was under threat in the late 19th century, that is the moment when the nostalgia for country life begins. That's the moment when city dwellers, like bankers, merchants, stockbrokers, when they come and want to have one of those houses in the countryside. So the country house becomes a symbol of ancestry, of, you know, this golden age that is vanishing suddenly.
Garden designer Chris Beardshaw is exploring why the Messels' new home presented great opportunities for creating a garden from scratch.
The appeal to Ludwig for coming to this space must in part have been its proximity to London, but also its relative remoteness. The idea that when we sit in this landscape, we don't see any towns or villages. So you do feel as though you are pioneering in that way. And in fact, he was pioneering with his design ideas, with his horticultural ideas and his horticultural passion. So it fits perfectly that he ended up here.
Ludwig Messel enlarged and altered the existing Georgian house. But the real focus of his attention was the garden. Even at this early stage, he demonstrated that he had hidden horticultural talents.
Ludwig was undoubtedly a horticultural entrepreneur. He was one of those individuals who wanted to create something slightly different. He was very much on trend, following fashions, leading fashions. And the greatest example, possibly in this garden, the first example, is the Heath Garden. The idea that one would introduce heathers and ericaceous specimens is something that hadn't occurred to anyone else, at least not with that particular range of plants. And it was that pioneering spirit that meant that only he was able to do it. He had the knack of being able to spot something different, deploy it in the garden, and then give it space to breathe.
Nymans was planted with rare and expensive plants. Ludwig's investment was considerable, no more so than in his pinetum, which he stocked with newly discovered trees. Alan Power is head gardener at Stourhead and has an unquenchable passion for trees. He's come to explore the collection at Nymans, which when planted in 1895 was another fashionable item on Ludwig's tick list.
And you've got to get up close to these things to really appreciate the scale. Look at the size of that tree.
These trees weren't just fashionable. Ludwig planned that they would also act as vital protection for his garden from the harsh prevailing winds.
You could create a shelter belt that would provide this almost a microclimate all year round, and it would protect your garden, it would protect the slightly more tender plants. But it didn't just perform that function. It performed a really curious, beautiful aesthetic function in the garden as well that gave you interest around every corner. It wasn't a cheap thing to plant a pinetum up. You know, in modern terms, on a young tree, you could be spending £300 or £400. And you know, when we look at the array of trees that are behind us here at Nymans, that £300 or £400 adds up pretty quickly. He could have spent his money on anything. He could have bought buildings, he could have built huge mansions all over the country. He chose to spend the money on his passion. These trees were his passion.
Ludwig's big ambitions also included being accepted by the local community. But with a name like Messel, it wouldn't be easy.
When Ludwig Messel arrived here as a German with of Jewish descent, he must have felt like an outsider, really, because at that time there was definitely still, you know, quite a bit of anti-Semitism going on here in England. For example, take the Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Jewish descent, but then he converts to Christianity. But every time there was kind of a problem with his politics, he was accused as being a Jew, a Shylock, a Fagin, a Chief Rabbi Benjamin. So they were really abusing him, and they always pulled out the kind of Jewish roots. So there are definitely discussions which are carried by anti-Semitism.
At first, Ludwig found it difficult integrating with the local squirearchy, but he had one thing in his favour. He discovered that many of them, especially his neighbours, shared his love for horticulture. This was Ludwig's way in.
It can't be an accident that a man who was so keen to not only stamp his credentials horticulturally, but to stamp his credentials from a social and cultural perspective, ended up in a neighbourhood surrounded by people who he must have admired.
This small corner of Sussex gave birth to a treasure trove of gardens, which were all famous in the 1900s for a unique Sussex style of woodland gardening. Board Hill, which is just 5 miles from Nymans, is a 200-acre estate run by 4 generations of one family and is famous for its rare trees. Leonardsley, also within a few miles, was celebrated for its range of prize-winning rhododendrons and unusual wildlife. And High Beeches, which shared a boundary with Nymans, was run by the Loder family. The Loders were members of an elite gardening dynasty who supported great plant hunting expeditions and packed their garden with fashionable new specimens.
The gardens in this particular part of England are hugely notorious. They are trendsetters. There's a great deal of competition between these gardens, and to gain that extra notch up, to get a slightly improved cultivar. And if you could name it after perhaps the gardener or the landowner, the designer, the garden itself, then so much the better.
Entering this elite gardening circle satisfied both Ludwig's social and horticultural ambitions. The friendly rivalry fueled Nymans' evolution, and Ludwig decided to start cultivating his own plants, greatly helped by a key personality, Nymans' first head gardener, James Coomber.
One of the key to successes, really, in creating a garden, especially a garden from scratch, is that you have to ally yourself with someone who really knows the business and knows what to do to cope with the conditions. And so Ludwig allied himself with Coomber, who was a man who understood how to get plants to perform. So what we see is a relationship where you have one person full of ideas and ambition and drive, and the other is the facilitator. And that is the great secret in a garden like this.
Ludwig was creating a garden for the long term, and it was to be shaped and moulded by successive generations of his family. Today, Ludwig's great-grandson, Alistair Buchanan, is still keenly involved with the garden's development. His contribution has been creating a number of sculpted box hedges.
I created those, and that is my legacy to the garden.
Alistair has a flat on the estate and works alongside the National Trust as the family advisor.
I don't have to pay the wages, and I don't give orders. But I can suggest and propose, and I'd like to think that I was a point of continuity. Therefore, I would hope to be consulted when there are changes and so on. Sometimes I'm not and so on, but it's really, I accept a level of sort of responsibility of keeping the family connected with the National Trust.
While Ludwig was absorbed with developing the garden, his large family of 6 children had grown up. His eldest son, Lenny, was pursuing a beautiful young socialite, Maud Sambourne. The Sambournes were highly artistic. Maud's father, Linley Sambourne, was a punch cartoonist and mixed with a fashionable London set. They lived at Stafford Terrace in Kensington, which today is preserved as a museum. Maud's family wealth didn't remotely match that of the Messels, but nevertheless Lenny was smitten. Maud, on the other hand, was less sure of her feelings and initially resisted Lennie during a 9-month courtship. She spent many weekends down in the country at Nymans, relaying her personal thoughts in letters back home.
These letters are really wonderful because they give us a real insight into Maud and what she thinks. So there's this funny, observant teenager. She's very cheeky. She's making fun of them being German. And there's again and again, it kind of pops up in her letters. And there's one which I find very funny because I'm German and I always get teased for being very punctual, where she says, "We are dreadfully regular. Everyone comes down the minute the second bell rings. Breakfast at 8 sharp, to the minute. Lunch at 3, also sharp, to the minute." You know, this is just a slightly stroppy teenager making fun of what she sees, but also describes very well what they're doing every day. And what she describes is this very typical life of the wealthy at that time, which is one big round of garden parties. There's tennis, there's croquet, photographed in sunshine, and everybody's happy and beautifully dressed. And this is exactly what Maud is presenting in her letters here.
Eventually, Maud fell under Nymans' romantic spell and agreed to marry Lennie. She's said to have finally accepted his proposal to her in the garden. Their marriage would combine Lennie's huge wealth with Maud's creativity and a shared love for the garden. So far, Ludwig's ambitions to establish his family at the heart of English society was paying dividends.
I think that Ludwig did everything according to the rule book, really. So he creates this image of England here at Nymans. He sends his children, his boys, to Eton, and he hangs out with the right people. So he is really moving up in English society. And when you look around, I think he was pretty successful with what he's trying to do.
But the birth of Maud's first child prompted her to express some observations about the family she'd married into.
There's a letter where she's just had her first son, Linley, and she's again writing a letter to her mother, who is in London. "I feel quite annoyed at it being a boy," so her son being a boy. "I only hope it will turn out a fair-haired, blue or grey-eyed youth, with a loyal feeling to his mother's side of the family. If he dares to have dark hair, well, I shall dye it golden." She makes it very clear. She wants her children to look like her, not like her husband.
The family thrived on country living. Lennie's youngest sister, Muriel, developed a keen interest in one area of the garden, which today is the centrepiece at Nymans, the herbaceous border, a key component in any serious English garden, and for Ludwig, a fashionable must-have on his tick list. This year, the garden team have completely reworked them, and after months of detailed planning, several thousand plants are carefully bedded out. 100 years ago, the borders were influenced by young Muriel. She was horticulturally very gifted, and her first ideas were shaped with the help of a big name in the gardening world, William Robinson.
Muriel was said to be guided by the great William Robinson, who, of course, is a most influential individual, somewhat curmudgeonly, very clear in his opinions on how gardens should be presented. He wanted to reintroduce nature. He wanted to really allow nature to sweep right into the heart of the garden. He wanted the informality of trees and woodland and meadow to offer that curtain, that backdrop to the border. And it's that marriage between informality and relative formality which Robinson was so carefully crafting at that time.
Robinson was reacting against the highly formal planting schemes of the mid-Victorian era, which favoured flat groups of densely planted perennials picked out like the patterns of a carpet. His vision was of borders that could be spectacular masterpieces in 3 dimensions.
These are the centrepiece of Nymans, really. It's very theatrical. You've got the fountain, the arch, and it sort of adds theatre and drama as you walk into this area.
Sadly, Muriel Messel didn't reach her 30th birthday. She fell victim to the deadly influenza pandemic, which killed 250,000 people in Britain. Her legacy, though, is now the crowning glory at Nymans.
It's lovely because it all goes out in one go, and it's just a good effect at the end of the day. You definitely have to wear your sunglasses when you come down this section of the garden because it's a bit like an 80s disco. We love it.
In the 1890s, one of the critical elements of a garden on the tick list of ingredients was undoubtedly the herbaceous border. It's a very new concept, it's a new idea, putting plants together, weaving them, creating a tapestry, using plants from around the empire, but it becomes the ultimate expression of control, manipulation and artistry within the confines of horticulture. And it is that impact, that high impact and drama that was demanded. That was the role of the herbaceous border, to draw you through the site. And it is like a theatrical performance. In 1890, when Messel first came here and set out his plans for a grand landscape and grand park and garden, I don't think he would ever have contemplated that a few years hence he would be open to the public and it would be treated as a public park. I'm sure he would have appreciated how many people come in through the gates and marvel at what he was able to achieve.
Ludwig created Nymans during a period that marked a change in the way that people thought about their gardens. The Messels made full use of Nymans as a focal point for endless garden parties and social events. It was something of a halcyon era, but it wasn't to last. Momentous social and political changes would ruffle wealthy families like the Messels.
The most extraordinary thing, I think, is Lloyd George's People's Budget. He introduces that in 1909, and this is the very first time in Britain that there's a serious attempt to redistribute wealth. So this is a budget which includes taxing, the rich. There is insurance for unemployed people. There is old age pensions. The death duty, again, is kind of increased. So this is why it's called the People's Budget. This is taking away power and wealth from the nobility and from the upper classes. This is the end of how the world used to be. And it scared people like the Messels. And there is an amazing photograph here in this album, which is titled The Budget. And on this picture, this is clearly taken in Nymans, in the garden. You see roses in the background, and you see one of the family members, a woman, all dressed up nicely, is standing on a piece of paper, which is clearly the budget, trampling on it. So they do not like what the Chancellor, Lloyd George, is doing there with this budget, because it's going to change their world. You know, and these are the last moments of this world.
However strong the family's reaction, they were not prepared for a far bigger event that would have much more serious implications. When war broke out in 1914, Ludwig found his loyalties were torn in two. He had relatives back in Germany, and although he'd lived in England for over 50 years, he still spoke with a German accent.
There is a moment in May 1915 when this anti-German sentiment really comes to a height, which is when the Germans, without warning, sink a passenger ship. 1,200 people die, and there are riots all over the country. So it must have been pretty awful for Ludwig in his kind of English lovely bubble here at Nymans. And it's so bad at that time that even the king, George V, thinks that he has to become more English, and he cuts all ties to his German relatives. He changes the very German-sounding name of the royal family, Saxe, Coburg, Gotha, into the House of Windsor. This is when it starts. So even the king thinks that he's too German at that time.
Ludwig's son Lenny had studied at Oxford, even enrolling in the British Army. But it wasn't enough to prevent the family being viewed with suspicion.
I think it must have been an absolute terrible time for him, because he tried so much to be English, and suddenly it just percolated down to this one thing: he is German.
In 1915, Ludwig died, heartbroken. During the war years, gardens up and down the country withered with neglect, but Nymans was more fortunate. Because of the family's German connections, Lenny was debarred from serving overseas. Instead, he was based close by, training up young soldiers, so he was able to prevent the garden from suffering. Lenny took Nymans over after his father's death, but he was surprised when his wife Maud declared her distaste for the house and wept bitterly at the thought of having to move in. Lenny found a solution, promising Maud she could completely remodel it.
The house we see today is very, very different to the house that Ludwig Messel moved into and extended. So if you look at the photograph, you can see a house which his daughter-in-law later called a hideous German folly, and I kind of agree with her a little bit. So her condition for moving here was that she would be allowed to completely rebuild the building. What Maud is doing here is she's creating an atmosphere of a family which has been here for centuries and centuries and centuries. They are part of England, and they have been part of England for a very, very long time. So she's not just moving back 100 years or a couple of hundred years. She's moving back centuries and centuries.
For Maud, this successfully rooted her young family. Nymans' rebirth was on a grand scale. It had a great hall, a billiard room, a library, and numerous bedrooms. The old German folly had been transformed, but at huge cost.
Well, it was never going to be a practical house. You needed a great many servants. And of course, the heating problems, the servant problems, it was totally impractical. I would have said it was a colossal waste of family money.
When they start building it in 1923, England is hit in post-war depression. So you have, for example, the 9th Duke of Devonshire in Chatsworth. Once one of the wealthiest families in the country is deciding to blow up the great conservatory in Chatsworth because he can't afford to heat it anymore. So you have the banker here, the kind of nouveau riche, creating this folly which gives them this link to England's past, which tells the story of continuity and very firmly places them into this golden age of when everything was still in order and land was power.
to remodel the architecture so that it appeared as if the architecture had perhaps been here longer than the garden, and the garden had flowed and was inspired by the architecture itself, I think was an absolute work of genius. It's something that really makes this garden stand out from any other. The bravery to say, this isn't working, but this piece is. Let's change this.
Maud hoped this costly refiguring would get the recognition she felt it deserved. She got her answer when Country Life wrote a glowing article about Nymans after the alterations were completed.
The Messels have really arrived in England. Their house is part of the English tradition. There's a wonderful sentence here. So clever a reproduction it is of a building begun in the 14th century and added to intermittently till Tudor times, that some future antiquary may well be deceived by it. So I think Maud would have been very proud opening this, seeing on the first page that she did such a good job that someone in the future might be deceived by it. Everything perfect, just as she wanted it.
The alterations meant the romantic house and garden now complemented each other perfectly. Lenny and Maud's influence in the garden pushed it to the top of fashionable gardens to visit and escalated Nymans' reputation. The pinetum had some rare species that were credited as the tallest in the country, and Nymans won the coveted Corey Cup for a new hybrid, Eucryphia nymanensis.
There's a great deal of celebration attached to the gardens and the plants associated with the Messels. And of course, many are hugely valuable in the horticultural world today and persist in our garden.
Lenny inherited his father's desire to be rooted in English society. He successfully cultivated numerous plants, which still thrive today. The Messel name became synonymous with good horticulture, winning prestigious prizes at the Royal Horticultural Society.
To be accepted by any Royal Society is a great mark of one's achievement, climbing socially. And to be accepted by the Royal Horticultural Society, well, it was the ultimate accolade. They've made it.
By the 1930s, the garden and family were at their peak. Lenny and Maud's youngest son, Oliver Messel, was emerging as a creative genius in the world of theatre. He would go on to be the most celebrated designer in stage and film. Many of Oliver's designs were set to be inspired by his upbringing at Nymans and the theatricality of the garden. Together with his sister, Anne, they were part of the fashionable Bright Young Things. Anne had 2 marriages. Her son from the first marriage, Anthony Armstrong Jones, carried on the family creative streak, becoming one of the country's best-known fashion and portrait photographers. And the family's rise reached a pinnacle when Anthony married royalty, becoming Lord Snowdon. But on her second marriage, Anne scaled new social heights herself, becoming a countess by marrying Michael Parsons, the 6th Earl of Ross, and moving to Ireland to live at Birr Castle. This created a marriage of 2 great gardens, which still continues today. Anne and the Earl of Ross's eldest son, William Parsons, inherited the estate and title in 1979. He has continued with the family tradition of being a very keen gardener, just as his parents were.
This portrait here is of my parents, set rather romantically in the garden of Birr, with my parents in that lovely attire, dressed though very much for gardening, as you can see from the little pair of secateurs and the tiny little fork at the bottom. It's lovely, I think, bringing together something of my mother's creativity and passion, my parents' passion for fashion and dress, with real love for gardening.
Anne's talent for gardening was no doubt inspired by her upbringing at Nymans. She was a skilled horticulturalist and quickly made her mark in the gardens at Burr.
These cloisters were designed in greater detail by my mother, very much in the back of an envelope, as a cloister with these windows looking into the great urns that are Baroque urns come from Bavaria. No element of the gardens here has, I'm afraid, ever been designed by any professional garden designer. It's always been designed by the members of the family in each generation in turn.
Evidence of Anne's creativity is unmistakable in the archives at Burr. House manager at Nymans, Rebecca Graham, has come to Burr to learn more about Anne's skills as a designer and horticulturalist.
Burr's got such an amazing archive, and it's got 2 whole sections devoted to the Messel family. So for us at Nymans, we've got a certain amount, but nothing like what's here. I'm interested in Anne, and to have her sketches and see them, and also to see the finished article, either in the garden or in the house. It's just amazing.
The relationship between the gardens at Burr Castle and Nymans was fruitful. Philip Holmes, acting head gardener at Nymans, visits Burr every year to ensure this close connection continues to thrive.
This is a wonderful wisteria. The way it's been trained in this sort of dome fashion is amazing. And the scent is very heady. And just hark at the bees. It's very important to keep a link with the family, and also over the years we've exchanged plants. Nymans has sent a number of the plants which were raised there and named after either the family at Nymans or the garden itself. We've exchanged here with Burr and vice versa.
Burr is especially well known for its rare tree collection, but William's real love is for exotic plants.
We can get underneath. The beauty of this Burr sensation, as it's now called, is that its flowers are basically purple, but round the edge of the purple, this is edged with white. And other people sometimes want to joke about this as being the floral equivalent of a good head to an Irish pint of Guinness.
Lord Ross has travelled the world to satisfy his thirst for plant collecting, but he only recently discovered that a consuming passion for collecting is actually a family trait.
From the age of 7, I'd started collecting coins. I'd been given the coin of William the Conqueror, and it started me in my own desire to go on collecting not only coins, but plants from all over the world, a passion for collecting, which I now realize is very much a Jewish tradition and was inherited. But that word was never used. The Jewish connection was, of course, never used in conversation with us. But it's made me realize, for instance, that I'm every bit as proud to be a Messel descendant as a Parsons descendant.
Lord Ross spent time at Nymans during the war years when he was a boy.
Now, Rebecca, let's see what you've been finding. I don't remember ever seeing that before.
Oh.
So I do remember being fascinated by the snow at Nymans as a small child. What does that say there, Rebecca? Can you read that?
William?
Yes, it is.
It's you.
It is me. Goodness, thank you for discovering that. I've never seen myself in the snow at Nymans before. That's a real finding. Lovely. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
In 1947, Britain was gripped by the worst winter on record. Nymans didn't escape the snow, and the bitter cold enveloped the entire house. A plumber with a blow lamp was on hand to thaw the frozen pipes.
In February 1947, in the night of Lenny's 75th birthday, he's lying in bed, he's recovering from a minor operation, and he wakes to see his room filled with smoke. When the fire brigade arrives, they find that the pipes are frozen, so they have to get the water from the pond below the house. So they're standing outside in the deep snow, cold, old, frail, Lenny and Maud just watching the flames licking away their house. It must have been heartbreaking for them.
No matter how hard the firemen fought, there was little they could do to save the house.
It was filled with their treasures, which they had collected all their life. So of course they wanted to rescue some of it, and the person who did that was the butler. But when you look at the pictures, it's just a tiny little pile of furniture, not much. Most of it just burned to the ground. This house was filled with treasures. Lenny had a very valuable painting, a Valeska painting, which was in the library above the fireplace. And there's a very touching story about this painting, because during the fire, there was very little time to rescue the valuable treasures in this house. And there was a choice, and the choice was between this very expensive painting and then a painting of Lenny's mother, which only really had sentimental value for them. And in the end, they chose Lenny's mother.
The house was uninhabitable. Lenny and Maud found temporary accommodation close by to recuperate and gather their thoughts. They lost many possessions, but the one that meant the world to Lenny was completely destroyed: his collection of rare botanical books. The terrible news spread quickly to the rest of the family.
I was at school in Oxford when I had news of the fire in a letter from my mother saying the greatest tragedy in the world had happened. Nymans had been burnt, and she'd rushed down to be with my grandparents there at Nymans, and how terribly difficult it was to organize anything or sort out anything because the snow was still very, very, very deep, and how obviously heartbroken my mother was at the loss of her own great family home. But the botanical collection of books went completely. What a tragedy that was.
The house had undergone its remodeling barely 20 years previously, and now a large part was reduced to rubble. Ironically, this only served to enhance the garden's romantic appeal.
If their aim and ambition was to create a piece of the Gothic ruin, a piece of Gothic romanticism, a Baroque castle, then what better way of demonstrating it than a genuine ruin? And so rather perversely, the fire is also responsible for heightening the romance that they so much sought.
Despite the disaster, Lenny and Maud made the extraordinary decision to keep the garden going. And over the intervening decades, the garden continued to thrive and attract critical acclaim. And today it still draws family members who visit regularly. Victoria is one of Lenny's grandchildren.
Smells peppery.
Victoria inherited the Messel creative gene with a talent for painting and an interest in botany. Over the years, she's recorded a vital botanical archive by painting the garden's rare plants, which was specially named after members of the family, like rhododendron Leonard Messel, camellia Maud Messel, and a magnolia named after their daughter Anne. Victoria's improvised studio was in the old dovecot.
It feels like home. And you get really good light here. You might not think it, but Excellent. Very, very good light.
Much of Victoria's early childhood was spent at Nymans during the war years. She had free rein of the garden, which was her playground.
My nanny, I think Miss Lawton, who took the photograph, I was just posed. As the Messels do, we pose.
The little dress Victoria wore is still intact in the Nymans archive, including one small blemish.
Wow, the colour has kept, hasn't it? Amazing. Oh, absolutely. Now then, I don't think that'd fit me much at the moment. But I love the colours, the clashing colours, amazing. The orange and the pink. I was given some chocolate ice cream for being so good and putting this off and being photographed. So then I had the chocolate ice cream and spilled it all on the front. There, all the way down. That was chocolate ice cream.
It is lovely. It still has the chocolate stain on it,
yes.
Because it just shows the whole.
How
whole
bloody
story.
greedy I was, yes. And they had to bribe me to put it on.
In 1953, Lenny Messel died. It heralded an end of an era. The family fortunes had dwindled after the war, and with no one family member able to take on the running of Nymans, it was willed to the National Trust. Lenny's daughter Anne returned from Ireland and lived on the estate at Nymans as the first family advisor. She was passionate about the garden and continued to shape and influence it. The courtyard garden was one area where she particularly liked to spend time in her advancing years. While the rest of Nymans was open to the public, this area was closed for her privacy. Nevertheless, she found it wasn't always easy working alongside the new owners, the National Trust.
You had to admire her spirit, but she wasn't a good person to get into a dispute with. She modelled herself, so to speak, on the Queen Mother. And if I was pushing her around the garden in a wheelchair, she'd be waving to the public, "Good morning, and how nice to see you," and so on. But not my style, but it was very much her style. I used to hear her muttering, "It's all mine. It all happens to belong to me," which it didn't, of course, but that was her approach.
Alistair took over as family garden advisor after Anne became frail. But he'd only been in the role 2 days when yet another disaster hit Nymans, this time one that would threaten the future of the garden.
I walked into the garden and hoping that the pinetum would be okay. To my absolute horror, I wasn't looking out onto the pinetum, I was looking out onto farm buildings, and there was just 2 big sequoias left, and that was it.
So obviously, most of the trees...
Philip Holmes, Nymans' acting head gardener, was a young member of the National Trust team in 1987. He rushed to Nymans to discover it had taken the full force of the storm, with devastating results.
What did it look like on that morning?
Well, it was like a battlefield, really. A bit like those photographs you see of the Somme. Just skeleton trees where they'd been thrashed to pieces by the wind.
Yeah.
And then there were trees lying on the ground, great big root plates had come up, you know, and they'd crushed many of the smaller trees beneath them, which was quite heartbreaking. You know, we lost virtually all the trees in this area.
The storm left Nymans in a very sorry state. Hundreds of rare specimens planted during the last 100 years were ripped from the ground in a matter of minutes.
You must have been itching to know what the garden looks like. Yeah.
I was. I knew the monkey puzzle on the main lawn had gone down, because from where I lived, you could see it on the skyline, and its distinctive rounded top shape was missing from the skyline. It was gone, so I knew that was down, and that was a great shame because that was getting on for 100 years old.
After the great storm, I wondered whether we would ever be able to open again. We'd lost 486 trees that night.
Despite the devastation, the unexpected bonus was the storm had opened the garden up. Areas that had become dense and overgrown now had a chance to breathe new life. Alan Power, head gardener at Stourhead, is going to take a closer look to see how one sequoia managed to survive the storm.
This is one of the most exciting trees. When they were first discovered, they estimated that the trees were touching, if not exceeding, 400 feet tall. And that is remarkable. Some of the tallest trees in the world. A really, really important tree on our planet. So we're right at the top of this sequoia, and blimey, what a view. That really is quite amazing. From where I am, this tree is the first thing that the wind hits. And, you know, it's maybe 120, 130 years old, and to have experienced 2 or 3 big storm events in its life, it only gave up once. And this scar tells the whole story. It will have been one point that the rhythm of the gusts and the rhythm of the wind and in relation to the tree, and when they were both working together, that rhythm was broken. It's just the point at which the tree went bang. So the story doesn't finish at the scar. You know, there's opportunities for the tree that came after the storm, and this is the tree's response. So it leads from the scar and it goes on off into the distance. Seeing the way it responded after the storm it just indicates how determined the tree was to survive, in the same way as the family went on to survive and be successful.
After the storm, Nymans had the chance to start afresh. This process of reinvigoration and restoration continues. The sunken garden is one of this year's big projects.
Well, this used to be all old camellias around this site, and we decided that many of them, because they started to look rather old and untidy, we would clear them out and have a fresh start. Changes have to happen.
The sunken garden is being reimagined, drawing from photographs from the 1930s. This careful balance between progress and preservation is watched over by Alistair Buchanan.
I think that would be the mid-1930s.
Do you?
But there's Coomber,
yes,
definitely standing like that. That, I think, could be Uncle Lenny.
Yes. And of course it shows the old myrtle plants which used to grow against the face of this building, which we're going to reinstate.
Restorations of gardens like this are key to their survival. Restoration doesn't mean that you're halting progress, at least not in the sense of Nymans. Restoration means that you're being consistent and you're remaining pure to the original ethos, philosophy and concept of the designer. And for Messel, it was certainly about constant investigation, exploration and advancement of his garden.
An example of this progress is the new South African bed, which has been designed by garden team member Kirsten Kelly.
So this bed used to be known as the wild bed to the Messels. So what we've done is introduce the South African collection, put it in a wild bed, and we've now got a South African meadow. So it's quite exciting.
By late August, the South African plants are soaking up the sunshine.
I mean, the whole idea was to kind of have a low planting to not interrupt that beautiful view over there, but attract the viewer's attention to it.
So how many of the plants that you've utilised in here would Messel have tried previously on this site?
Well, we know quite a few details because they were definitely growing Melianthus major at the time. And that's quite an interesting plant because, I mean, it's supposed to be evergreen. And here it's cut back by the frost and it reshoots every year. So. And
much more familiar to us today than it would, of course, have been in his day. I think one of the lovely things about these gardens is that it gives you permission to create really quite brash, colourful combinations, as you do in the herbaceous board, as Muriel would have been very familiar with in the herbaceous board. And here you are reintroducing colour combinations that on paper shouldn't work together.
I think the beauty of Nymans is that the Messels were experimenters, they were innovators, and it's testing something new, and that's what they did. You know, the beautiful thing is our responsibility to protect the legacy, but it's also our responsibility to go and try new things, and that's why Nymans is exciting.
It's become an annual tradition that the Messel family still gather at Nymans to remember and reflect on Ludwig's legacy.
It's glorious being back at Nymans, and being back at Nymans for such a great family reunion. But it's certainly true that gardens can never stand still. Gardens either grow or they go back, sadly, with seed, and they need to be reinvigorated. But what is essential, I think, is to keep something of the original vision of the person who's created the garden.
For me, the legacy of Nymans is very much the principle of understanding the celebratory nature in which the garden was established, that sense of fun and theatre and enjoyment and romanticism. And that's what we see crafted out of the landscape before us. And it's wonderful to see the family today, even though they're slightly more distant, maintaining a close interest in how this garden continues to move forwards.
I think Ludwig, my great-grandfather, would be pleased. I'm of an age now where I should be meeting up with him fairly soon, no doubt, and I'll find out.
I think my great-grandfather Ludwig's spirit will always be in the garden somewhere, even if you don't see it. You feel it hovering there on Philip's shoulders.
One of the most intriguing aspects of this for me has been that this is a story about a family driven by ambition, incredibly creative, who arrived here as outsiders and then rose through the ranks of society and built the most quintessential English garden. What a triumph.
3, 2, 1, cheese!